Well, good evening, friends, family, colleagues from work, ladies, gentlemen. This is quite an event. I'm not quite used to speaking in such a broad front. You know, it's professional, it's technical, it's family, it's whatever, but you're all here today, and that's quite daunting. Also, this is not a lecture to the Royal Aeronautical Society, so I have to try and keep some balance and why, and explain, perhaps, why I'm even talking about flying and hovering. What relationship could it have to making things, broadcasting? And I'll try and explain that without shifting the whole agenda over too far into vertical flight. Now, does this work? Yes, it does. The other agenda is very nice to hear both, particularly how interconnect connectivity, preserving standards, preserving quality is part of SMPTE. And that speaks to me. And of course, for ARI, I have a very fond memory of that, because right from my first years in the BBC as a young trainee, when pictures were absolutely awful, particularly I worked in experimental colour for a bit, the pictures were absolutely ghastly by any standard, particularly the standard of any old bit of film. And for years, my colleague David Lyon and I, though it took a long time before we met on this subject, but we found we did meet mentally, film was our reference. If ever you were in any doubt about a picture, you sort of thought, well, what does it look like on film? And that even went as far as immersive television, because there was an engineer in the BBC, heaven knows where he ended up, called Geoffrey Carter Platts, who had a 2-inch, 2¼ square camera and a wonderful projector, which for me was immersive because it was the complete sitting room wall from corner to corner, ceiling to floor. Now, it's true as that Andy wants it all the way around. Well, I'm happy to have one screen which is that big. And if it's 8K, it'll be sharp enough. So as soon as I saw that in 1961 or 2, I was absolutely clear that that would be something to go for. And now we probably could do that. So that's the sort of the far future. And it's still quite far in the future, even though now we can do 8K and you can have a 4K projector, 4K camera. I suddenly noticed that my little Panasonic non-SLR camera is 16 megapixels, and it costs peanuts. So, and it can take movies as well. So for me, though, when I was very little, I didn't know about crystal sets or electricity, but I did know about flying. And this, to me, is very interesting in how I sort of dare to or presume to introduce the idea. I'm convinced I was flying well before 5 at 3, at least in my head. And if I concentrated enough, I could levitate like a balloon. I didn't run along a runway and rotate like planes. I didn't know about that, but I knew that if you really concentrated, you could rise above the world and escape terrors and have fun. So that's why, for me, from 3 on, flying. Music and audio came later. And I justify this by saying, well, you know, Ray Dolby, he started with video recording, then went to noise reduction, and then took up audio in the end. So between audio and video, a lot of the metaphors are similar. And I found that most of my time, my real passion was audio. But if you have a sense of perception and what's good and what's grainy and what's sharp and what's not sharp and what works, I found flipping between the two not too bad. It isn't a great struggle. So the way I worked, and I think most do, and I'll try and give some evidence for it, that between 3 and 15 years I used to think it, or perhaps dream it, make it if I could, and then fly it. From 8 to 18 years, I tried to understand it. This was electricity. I'll then try and make it, crystal set or whatever, and then try it. It wouldn't fly, but it flew if I could get some radio coming out of the headphones. Obviously, stereo was the fun thing when I was in my teens. It was immersive sound. It was a big step forward. I remember when first building a stereo system, saying to my father, what do you think of this? And he said, well, I can hear that the fiddles are on the left and the cello are on the right, but so what? And I hadn't got it right because I hadn't got a sounds picture. And in fact, I realized from his response that It was like an out-of-focus sound stream. I then got into working into loudspeakers, and then what kind of array will give you a solid image, not just fiddles on the left and cello on the right, but an orchestra or a choir, solid. And the test was to get the stuff in the middle right. If you had two speakers at the end, if you can't get the stuff in the middle right, you haven't got the stereo right. So that has its analogues, if you like, in vision. Now I have to sort of argue how do you know I was dreaming at 3? Well, babies dream, they can measure their eye movements in the womb actually, and they start dreaming after a few months. So the idea of recreating some sort of experience, even though we are still in the womb, you're still recycling or recirculating what you've done. As I said, that vertical takeoff, Batman does vertical takeoff. He doesn't have to rotate along a runway. And so that's pretty basic, I think. Now, this, as I say, is not a Tracy Emin bedroom, but it's this summer, 4 grandchildren disappeared for the whole afternoon into the furthest bedroom in the house, and they converted it. They were between 6 and 11 years old, and they built a spaceship. And that if it doesn't look like a spaceship, it's your lack of imagination. That's a spaceship, got it? And they flew it around the solar system for the whole afternoon, doing no trouble to anyone, and then came down home for tea. So that is what children do, and it's a critical thing for me of creativity. If children can do it, why do we forget it as we get older? Just sort of coming forward to show that this isn't always accepted. When we got one of our Queen's Awards, and I can't remember which one, hence the equation at the top, Dame Mary Fagan, on the occasion of a Queen's Award, surely, Roderick, you never dreamed that Snell Wilcox would be successful. Well, what the hell did she think I did? Now, I couldn't actually make a hovering machine until I was 10 or 11. This is the make it bit. And it was only when JetX produced little tiny little tiny rockets, really, in metal cans that burned tablets of some sort of combustible stuff. You put them on each blade, or else on a cross piece, you stuck these 2 jet engines, lit them. If you lit them out of sync, it's rather damaging. You have to get them starting at the right time, no doubt. And helicopters are much more fun than fixed wing, because fixed wing disappeared over the hill, and I hadn't got any radio, so helicopters stayed, and you could enjoy them. And so that was the first real flying thing that I made. And then back to the audio. Of course, there was no electricity where I lived, so crystal sets, amplifiers, loudspeakers, and the adventures with stereo sound. That's how it was. Williamson amplifiers sounded better. No one could tell me quite why. It had a huge output transformer, but I did build them, set up speakers of various sorts, and where do you get stereo sound? Well, I've recorded some with difficulty, but they started cutting long playing records with a crystal pickup made in Holland somewhere. But I did discover quickly the loudspeaker was more important. It's rather like the camera is more important than a lot of the intermediate stuff. Cameras, as Bill Lovell would I'm sure say, cameras and lenses are pretty critical, and 2 good ones will look different. 2 good amplifiers, you quite struggle to hear the difference. But every loudspeaker, even if it costs 50,000 quid, is different from a 60,000 quid one, and not necessarily worse or better. So that was fun, and I really enjoyed making electrostatic and ribbon and all kinds of speakers, and it was quite easy to get them to speak, if you like. I don't think it would have been easy in those days to do it with cameras. Although I did share a flat, and that comes a little bit later, with people who made cameras, and I think Mike Cox, who's here tonight, was part of the British Amateur Television Club. And it was winding scan coils on old toilet rolls, inners, was part of John Tanner's exercise. So if I'm an engineer, I better get a job. I'd rather enjoy it. I had a jazz band, and I lived in the country, and I didn't seem. People were surprised I wasn't sort of ambitious, but I was quite happy as I was. And then it dawned on me that perhaps I should get a job, and I should have been studying, but playing jazz was more fun. And I hadn't thought that the long-term effect would be no. What actually was one thing, I did see some jazz musicians like me, but they were 20 years older, and they looked terrible. So the playing circuits in Germany in smoky cellars aged you very quickly, and even I could see that. So I was encouraged by someone to apply to the BBC for a job. As an audio engineer, I said, I'm in the musicians union, I can play, and I cut discs, and I make microphones, and I know what I'm doing. And they said, well, there's nothing happening in sound, but television is going colour, so why not join colour? So they gave me a job. I wasn't very well qualified, so they called it an engineer, but really it was a technician, a television technician. But colour was coming. ITV was making, and I think the reason I got the job, ITV was taking out qualified BBC technical staff because they were just starting up. And BBC managers were probably desperate. So the BBC as a trainee engineer, probably the best employee I ever had over those 6 or 7 years. They were, in so many ways, good to work with and to work for. I absorbed a bit of, despite my attempts at audio, I did absorb a bit about television, but keeping my private interest in audio. But colour was interesting. And I worked in experimental colour because we didn't have a lot of colour studios, and they were rather special, Studio H. But telecine, we were playing with colour, playing with encoders and decoders and displays. And my flatmate, John Tanner, at Lime Grove, was then running the all-new television centre. Was then after that I went to the all-new television centre. And I experienced the processes of international standards politics, and that actually had quite an effect on all the future things I got involved with. And there were battles over TV standards in Europe, and that's a rather fun book. You'll notice that the French have slightly modified the map. Britain seems to have shrunk. And that's because, though we had our own, BBC did have some colour encoding ideas, they didn't push them. And the pressure from Paris, and then from Germany, Telefunken, and of course America, meant that we sat on the fence. But we did, where we worked, see all 3 standards. And we even had an NTSC set at home, which we managed to get from a scrapyard. You weren't allowed to buy things in the BBC, even if they were being scrapped. You had to hear that they'd been junked, and then this research department, or designs department TV, was in a scrapyard, and we rushed off and bought it and set it up. To get the signals we needed, we had a 30-foot lattice mast on our house in Harrow, and people complained, so the local MP came to tell us to take it down. We told him we were very important doing research into colour, and we got our friends to play a tape, a film rather, by churches in Kent or something. He was so impressed by that, all complaints were withdrawn. He felt we were important researchers. Making stuff. Now, in the BBC, television technicians don't make stuff. You get proper people do that. But the fates being what they were, I found myself in what was called a special projects group, which is a way of getting round the rules. And there's a bunch of us, including an old friend who isn't here tonight, Brian Cuff, who became, in the end, chairman of Television Systems Limited. And we were both making the same sort of stuff to automate a telecine. And that was fun. In the meantime, my flatmate John Tanner and a friend of his, David Mann, with people like Mike Cox encouraging him, who was himself making things, he was making CCAM stuff. And there's a lesson there that I learned from Mike Cox. When there's a fight about standards, it's rather like being an arms dealer. What you really want is war, good solid wars between people, and then you sell the guns to both sides if possible. And with standards, the more chaos in standards, the more fun you have translating them, making converters, selling plugs and adapters and all the rest of it. So roll on World War III in television, and the makers of this sort of stuff will prosper. I wasn't interested in business, so I did make some speakers and kit for friends, but not really for business. And that was quite fun, because I did do some redesign for products, but not very professionally, but they did appear, articulated pickup arms and other things. And I did also make, which I'm most proud of making, probably the world's finest phono cartridge. It was unmanufacturable, according to the people who he showed it to, like Autofon and others. They said, it's much too small and we can't even see it. Well, that's what you needed for not damage the record. Granville Cooper made some fine condenser microphones, and I've still got one. It was rather, it works well, and you realize you could make things in your kitchen and in your garage if you know what you're doing. And at this stage, part being in the BBC, I learned to fly gliders. That was as near, there was a gap between flying model helicopters and gliding, but then I was busy with audio and stuff. And gliding was a very important bit of my life. Is where do you learn what to do? Well, where to go. Rather than lessons of philosophy, have some flying lessons. They'll sort you out psychologically, spiritually, physically, every other way. Because to fly well, you've got to be absolutely in balance, totally aware of what's going on, and sort of not nervous, not in a hurry, not sick, not anything. And I was lucky to have a teacher who was himself an absolute top pilot. He's written most of the books on gliding. And in my logbook, I looked it up the other day, at 1961, he said, bad ruddering into turns and planning doubtful. Now that was absolutely on the nail. That described me better than a passport photograph. So Derek Piggott, bless him, he still flies. He comes to Lasham Gliding Club, quite an old man now, but, and so he's not an instructor anymore, but he's still a damn good pilot. Now, after all that, I had to stop and think, what was I going to do? Did I work in TV? Was I in broadcasting? Did I want to make things, and how do I make things? So I left the BBC after 6 odd years, for family reasons. I worked as a sound engineer for North Gloucestershire Education, designing language laboratories, and got to know a translator who was one of the clever guys who decoded wartime secrets and was a very good linguist. And he gave me a very good reference and got me a job in the University of Sussex. And in parallel with this, I'm still keeping my enthusiasm for audio, which leads me to collaborate with this third genius, and he was the one who I did my world's best pickup. And I worked with him for quite a long time. And the electrostatic phono cartridge, for the engineers, electronic engineers in the house, there was a stylus suspended with no coils, no crystals, no nothing. The capacitance between the stylus and the detector was 10 to the minus 14 farads, 20 millipuffs. And I needed to get a 70 dB signal from that. And I did, I was proud of it too. And the inventor of the quad electrostatic speaker, Peter Walker, came and we played it to the BSRA and it was okay. The sad thing was that only the Japanese could make it. They said they'd have a go. But no one in Europe that we could find was willing to make it. And they said it's too small, and my partner in crime, who you'll now be introduced to, he's the man on the right, Alessandro Rizzo Rangaby. He was, his father was Greek ambassador in Berlin, and another genius who could play the Beethoven violin concerto and also be a lawyer and also a diplomat, and had reinvented Paganini's fingering style in order to play the way he did. And his son, Alex, he was tall and lean. He looked just like the Knight of the Doleful Countenance, as the novel has it. And I felt I was very much playing Sancho Panza to this bright chap. But I did work with him as long as I could afford it, because he didn't make a lot of money. So that was probably the most adventurous thing I did in audio, is an electrostatic pickup that played within the elastic limit of 200 milligrams, I think was the most you could put down. 0.2 grams was the heaviest pressure you could put on a long-playing record without wearing it out. Now I was at the University of Sussex, and I felt I wanted to use video, not just entertain with it. So hence I was working, it seemed to me, video libraries and video as we now use it was an opportunity. Flaherty in America was the high priest of electronic news gathering, and he managed to use what was thought of as Toy Town video recorders to capture news faster than film, and film could be processed. In the University of Sussex, we hired David Lyon, no, University of Brighton, sorry, from BBC Southampton. Why I hired him was because he'd made his own Wireless World oscilloscope so beautifully that 15 years later it was immaculate and worked. He had to redesign the wireless world circuits, but he made stuff that lasted, and that there was a lesson there. And I discovered that you could connect a camera to a video recorder without combining the chrominance and luminance signals. If you kept them separate and recorded them in the same way, you produced a compatible signal which was superior. And that became a standard, a world standard actually, called YC connector. At that stage, I formed a partnership with Joe Wilcox, who's here this evening, and we set up, he already had a company which I was parasitical to, and that's how he set up a business. This work led to UNESCO workshops on low-gauge VCRs. In other words, what I said was new, and the experts in the BBC, like Brian Jenkinson, said, it'll never happen. These Toy Town things will never work. And helical scan is rubbish. You'll never be able to trace a long track on a thin tape. It's hygroscopic. It's elastic. You'll never catch it. Well, of course, they found ways of doing it. And the helical scan technology was as successful as the investors thought it might be, and the BBC was as wrong as they could ever be on that. Now, there was in those days, the connection between cheap video recorders, or simple little video recorders, and the studio, to make proper use of it, was the time-based corrector, which was a little digital island, difficult and expensive to make, and there weren't many people who could understand it. So I gave a talk to they literally had a conference on time-based correction. It was thought to be so important and educational. And I said I wanted one that asked for the moon. It was a synchronizer, which meant things needed to be synchronous because they could roll through. It was a time-based corrector, could steady an unstable video recorder. It was a standards converter. And while I was doing all that, I wanted some color correction and enhancement because I've got a big digital box. I might as well have those things. And I remember some of the best designers of time-based correctors in the UK in the audience chuckling away at this ridiculous idea. But it did result in a grant from UNESCO. We got a grant to look at what could be made with $25,000 and a bit of effort from this angry young chap. In the meantime, we made our living by modifying video cassette recorders and upgrading them. We were a sort of tuning specialist. We could alter the carrier frequency, change the tape, and feed the chroma and luma signals in separately so that they didn't cross over each other and get in each other's hair. And that process, the manufacturers in Japan were cross with us about that because they had their own plans for distribution and timing, and we were taking Japanese-American standards and converting them to PAL and CCAM before their plans to release in Europe. And so the supplies were stopped. And I was very lucky that Mitsubishi Electric, we partnered with them, and they're the only ones who would partner with us to make TV screens into studio monitors. They were the only ones who had isolated chassis, and so by putting connectors on them, we had a whole range of monitors which all sorts of people bought, and it saved our bacon. In the meantime, we were experimenting with this synchronizer. And it was an interesting moment when Martin Allard said to me one morning, "Hey, Rod, look at this picture. What do you think?" And I said, "Well, there's something funny with it. Is it interlaced? What's wrong?" He said, "It's actually BBC, but coming out at 60 hertz, sorry. I've field rate converted it." And it was a bit jerky and a bit funny. And we later learned, as we sort of took this more seriously, it was more or less equivalent to the IBA's DICE, Digital Intercontinental Conversion Equipment, which was a 6-foot rack. And it cost about £150,000 even in 1965. So we discovered we could make a rather dirty standards converter, throw it in with this box, which is actually doing all the other things. Now, David Lyon, in the meantime, well, not quite then, while I was working at the university, he was headhunted by Sony, setting up their new broadcast division in Basingstoke. And the DTI in those days was quite as it should be now. And this is rather interesting because they gave us some money to make the British VTR. And so when I said to the Department of Trade and Industry, we're going to make a British VTR, they said, "Oh, fair enough, how much do you want?" They gave us £12,500, and we made one. It failed commercially because I realized as I got into it, I mean, we made a working 2-inch segmented scan Bosch Fernseh machine. A lot of fun. We put Electrocraft on the map because they made an analog TBC that had a 6 meg bandwidth. And so things came out of it. And many, many years later, when I said to the old chap from the Department of Trade and Industry, you know, why did you must have known this was a bit of a crazy scheme. He said, yeah, but it was only £12,500. And I was, you two seem quite bright guys. I knew something would come out of it, if only developing skills. And he said, I couldn't do that now. They'd have the Dragon's Den on me, and they'd look at quarterly returns and cash flow and investment from patents. The whole thing would be a financial calculation, not a project. Could you make it work? And I thought there was something quite important in that. So we find that this box, this synchronizer TBC with frame rate change, sort of works, and we were able to make 1 or 2. Problem was people kept ordering them, and I wasn't used to that. And they took 40 hours at the very least to get them to work. They all seemed different. The memory timing, variations in everything. It was an absolute nightmare to make. And so then David Lyne was in charge, and he, having had 4 years at Sony, had learned about manufacturing discipline. He was very good. He ironed out the bugs, did a lot of improvements, and we were then suddenly almost like grown-up manufacturers. The other key part of the equation in making things is the sort of military discipline you need to make things the same and reliable. Apart from the design element, running a factory is like running a little army. And he and David Lyne and Jim Goodwin worked together on automated or pick-and-place machines and the software needed for manufacturing. It's quite an effort as a small company to do that sort of thing, but we managed. Now we're beginning to sell this stuff, and again, as engineers who work project-wise, it was pretty terrifying to realize you needed to order large quantities of parts, long lead times. There were all sorts of organizational problems in really manufacturing. Barry Flanagan joined from the IBA, who's here tonight, somewhere there. And I don't know whether he'd made things before, but he was a good designer, and he was surprisingly fast. He was the quickest gun in the company. He'd make stuff in his lunch hour. That's what we thought. He'd suddenly come up with something new. And that, of course, some people were rather jealous about that, particularly people who took a very long time to make things, felt there's something shady about Barry, you know, perhaps it's magic or something. What we were learning from our success with our converter was we had the roughest conversion algorithm in the business. But it's acceptable if the product is reliable and it'll work with flaky inputs and noisy mains. And it got called the Jesus box, I think, by the Australians, because whatever they put in, there's a steady signal coming out. It was a bit jerky and a bit funny, but it was actually, it always played, and that got us a lot of credit. The other thing was, back on the question of standards, we ended up with, I think, 6 standards in, and I can't remember, we had 6 out. But we had to cover oddball standards, CCAM 60, analog components, YC, NTSC 443. That was a weird standard, but very, very valuable for people playing American tapes in Europe and getting a far better luminance resolution and less cross-color. So we went mad on standards, and our boxes had everything you could think of in them in analog form, and that was to our benefit. But you couldn't monitor them, because no grade 1 decoder, no grade 1 monitor had all the decoder for these standards. And as for vector scopes, well, there were some very rare CCAM vector scopes. We made a 6 standard vector scope waveform monitor with an output to a monitor. We asked all the customers, would you like such a thing? And they all said no. So then we made it, and they said, that's a good idea. And we sold a lot of them. So there was a lesson there, again, about people. It's Akio Morita's advice, look for need, don't look for what people ask for. The salesmen just want it cheap, so they don't have to work to sell it. And people want what they were asked for yesterday. But Morita was good, and when I saw him working, his colleagues working in the broadcast, when they were looking at cameras, they just stood around and watched for years before they made a camera. And when they made it, and Peter Wilson probably saw a lot of this in his work, when they made something, they'd got a lot of it right. Not always, but they took that pretty seriously. So we were beginning to understand now with this sort of growing business, it's going into where we think the competitors had not got it right, and maybe where Mike Cox got things right is that television is going international faster than anyone had imagined. I know the BBC, when they made their first standards converters, said 12 in the world will cover all international exchange needs you'll ever need. Well, we've probably made 10,000 standards converters, and we're still selling them. And of course, there's now HD, and then there's 3D, and then there's other stuff. So the internationalization of TV standards, of television rather, and the proliferation of standards that are still hasn't stopped, means the conversion, transcoding, field rate changing hasn't gone out of fashion. It's like wars, I suppose, by that analogy. Our self-contained converters included several multi-standard processing systems. This was the next thing we learned. So in this box, which was a standards converter, we had Genlock sync systems with all the standards. We had synchronizers and time-based correctors, color correctors, composite color encoders and decoders, a lot of bits. And if you saw these things up, there was a sort of modest business in selling those bits where you didn't want a whole standards converter, but you wanted something. The standards converter in those days was a digital island, a clever bit in the middle of an analog world, as John Baldwin put it of the IBA. And so that had taken us into a different league. So when digits became ubiquitous, we were sort of, well, you know, somewhere ahead. David Lyon joins the board because he's clearly bright and important to the company. I left the university. David Yulton joins as CEO. This is when Joe was as a consultant. Joe became a consultant and sort of retired. I borrowed a fortune to buy out his shares. And it's 1998, still too much to do, and HDTV is flickering on the horizon. It's not quite there. David Yulton sees a recession looming, which is interesting. No one else did. And so we recruited like mad. That's where being a Marxist economist was useful. He did the exact opposite of every straight economist. And sometimes it worked. Then the big find, the big sort of love affair for us was finding that there was a bright bunch of people in Kingswood Warren in Surrey, full of ideas and a bit frustrated, and for me, underrepresented. Because what we discovered was, and I discovered it rather later when we were bought out, that manufacturers didn't like to admit how much they owed the BBC, because it sort of lowered their share price. They like to present themselves as extremely clever. The fact that some BBC engineer or some researcher had produced a patent, had produced phase correlation, or a multi-field filter, spatial temporal filter, that sort of thing. Some felt that to praise that was at their expense somehow. Well, we didn't. We were extremely glad of them. Just as the IBA produced the first standards converter called DICE, Digital Intercontinental Conversion Equipment, the BBC made a slightly better algorithm with more fields of interpolation and called it ACE, Advanced Conversion Equipment. And our first box was a DICE, but later on we built ACEs. We got to know the BBC and started sharing and paying our share of patents that we used. And we did quite a lot of joint patenting too. And then Electrocraft, chap who I'm sorry isn't well enough to be here tonight, but he was a company of analog masters in Liss in Hampshire. And we took over their company and allowed him to retire because his managers had got the company in a bit of a mess. Barry Flanagan, who's here this evening, took over that bit of the company and built his team on their Liss premises. At that stage, with knowledge from the BBC, we started work on proper four-field temporal filters, BBC ACE. And we offered an upgrade kit to the existing machines. Barry Flanagan shrunk our 6U box, as it was, with smart use of memory, of Fujitsu memory, into a 1U box. And the advert said it was an ACE in a fraction, no, a DICE in a fraction of the price. And then a year later, 2 years later, he shrunk the BBC ACE, which was another 6-foot rack. As it just shows you how technology changes. And it was an ACE. It was DICE at a fraction of the price and an ACE in a fraction of the space. I was helping to establish our credibility in Hong Kong because our competitors were ahead in conversion. We were trying to demonstrate that we were as good as any of our competitors, and I worked very hard with that. Not really as a salesman, but arguing about comb filtering and bandwidth and the subjective effect of sampling and so on. And we sold, I think, 8 of our big converters to Star TV. Also unearthed the potential market for hundreds of small converters. And our CEO expressly forbade the idea in order to, he felt he was preserving our brand. So Barry and I continued secretly for 6 months. And our new converters, like the Hong Kong, were gaining some acceptance. So we still have, but we had low bandwidth internal processing. And it was very interesting because those who looked at pictures, we got most of the business. Those who looked at simply at sweeps and pulse and bar bought the competitors because they had a higher sampling rate and all the test signals for the post office engineers looked better. But the pictures, our pictures look better. Against the rules, I got a very good order from Hong Kong for this. We have several hundred of these little converters. And we put 5 of these converters in a box and sold hundreds of the boxes, so God knows how many. But it put the company financially on its feet, I think. Now, the next big hurdle, which really was a more ambitious one, BBC R&D had worked on image analysis with fast Fourier transforms, real-time spectral analysis of images. And Graham Thomas, I think, had started it because he saw a paper by Bell Labs in America and thought, this is interesting. And then it all went quiet. And he thought, the military want it. That must be interesting. So he went on his own looking at the effect of seeing how you might practically do a real-time fast Fourier transform on a moving picture. And when they got it working, they offered it to everyone except us. So I was a bit cross with Bruce Moffat, who was then head of R&D at Kingswood. And he said, well, I thought you weren't a broadcast company. I thought you just made stuff for Toy Town stuff, you know, non-broadcast. The BBC were using our converters already, so we were cross about that. And so we took our option on fast Fourier transform technology from the BBC. And chips existed, made by Plessey, £5,000 to £6,000 each. You needed 8 for a standard definition converter. A discount for quantity we could have got, they went down to £3.50, but David Lyon checked some samples and they weren't good enough. They were good enough for target tracking with the military. If you missed the odd plane, it didn't matter. But if you got a great black splat in the middle of the screen, people phoned up the BBC. So we needed a higher standard than the military spec for that chip. So we persuaded them to respin the chip and fix the faults. And then David went into Purda again, David Lyon, and said, it's still not good enough. These splats are all over the place. So he then hid in his office for weeks and produced a kind of median filter which papered over the cracks when the arithmetic rounding went wrong. In the meantime, we got funding to, knowing what had been done with systolic arrays in Royal Radar establishment, someone who'd worked there, Professor John McCanney, was now in Belfast. And with him, we built our own chips with help from the EPSRC, plus other support from government. And this technology used in frame rate conversion, slow motion, MPEG compressors, and noise reducers. So it was the technology that we adopted and have made good use of for the last decade, I think. How about HD? Well, I think it was Barry's fault to start because people asked about down conversion, and I think he did it in his lunch hour because he saw the front of a standards converter and stuck a rather crude filter on the front so that you could put high definition in and that you got any one of 6 standards out. BBC thought that would be a jolly good idea. You could have a high definition camera in Wimbledon and then feed out standard definition to the public. They liked the idea but not the algorithm. It was a bit of a scruffy signal. So they offered to pay for a better down converter. David Lyon took it on, and a year later he delivered it minutes before the thing started, or some hours before the thing, Wimbledon started. And so we now had 2 HD products. Barry's very useful multi-standard interface, so that when you were doing high definition production, you didn't use the awful huge analog recorders they had, but you could have an offline copy on a 3/4 inch tape or something. How am I getting on? Oh yes, that's having done this one high-quality HD product, we found ourselves making down converters, up converters. Martin Weston joined us from the BBC research department. Mike Nee came back from Thomson, who had been headhunted by Thomson from Kingswood Warren. And Peter Wilson, with his background in Sony as an HD product manager, was very helpful in knowing what our strategy should be and which direction to go. So we realized that these products are critical to the introduction of HDTV. Vision mixers, I'll quickly go through this. CEL and Saffron Walden were strong competitors in standards converters, so we got together with them, and together we formed the basis of a new vision mixer group. Progress was a happy result of a wide range of skills and experience. Phil Martin, later Dave Bingham from Sintel, Gavin Walker from Sony, David Lyon still. And we made, with Gavin Walker and David Lyon, we made a strategic investment in new silicon for vision mixers, and it gave us a year over everyone else on the planet, because we could take all the standards, 720p, 1080i, we could take both field rates, and this, of course, no one else had that chip, which Gavin's initiative, who's here tonight, David Lyon, did a deal with a company called Giga in Denmark, I think, and Peter Wilson knew about the progress of vision mixers and their life cycle and the timescales and strategies. That was very important. So we then had a big switcher, and we were able to compete. And the last person in that, Phil Haynes, was a user. He had the best studio in Zurich. He was British, and we persuaded him to come back to England, retire to us, and he had a vision of how to do a proper vision mixer with a touch control, which everyone else said would bankrupt us, but it was a success. I think it won a Queen's Award, the last Queen's Award. So we were well into HD, and it's interesting note, just in terms of perception, I asked the industry, giving a Schoenberg lecture in November 2002, given very much in collaboration with ARRI, who were key partners, because by then we were working with them on a big project, an ambitious project. Is HTV wasted on broadcasters? And the answers dribbled in up in the next few months, up to NAB next year. And the answer was, yes, it is wasted on us, because we can't see any business case for it. That was 2003, April. Now, they said they liked the pictures that were ARRI's responsibility, and they liked the sound from this phase array speaker I was using. But that summer, under Brendan Slamin's guidance, the DTG widescreen forum changed its name to the HD forum. At IBC that September, the industry seemed to talk about nothing else but HD. So they couldn't see ahead even 6 months. The business community, if it isn't in the Financial Times or something, it doesn't exist. But all it needs is some trigger. We don't know what it is. Maybe Sky says we're doing HD, and suddenly everyone, you've experienced that, suddenly everyone says it won't work. There's no money in it. Sky does it. And they're in business, and it works. So there's a lesson there somewhere. We did an awful lot of collaborations, and I'm not going in. I think there's so much in that. It's an evening on its own, and we should get someone else to do that. We made the British Studio VTR. It failed, but it got Dave Lyon into manufacturing and designing. That was worth £12,500. UNESCO-funded synchronizer was $25,000. That was a good investment, I think. We did a collaboration in America with chip designers, which failed miserably and ended up in a Los Angeles court. That was a real loss. BBC Extended PAL codecs failed. They were too late and too costly, but they worked beautifully, and we could have done a very big thing with Matsushita, but the extra year meant it didn't work. GeForce was generic formatting for storage. This is trying to get files standardized, and so that when you stored the file, it was a standard file. We got money for that, and then we went and asked people, and we realized that no big manufacturer is going to change his storage secrets for us. So we changed our story, gave some of the money back to the commission, and said, we've changed our mind. What we want is the interface, and that was MXF. And that's become a world standard. So the failures, I'm arguing really that the failures are as important as the successes. And if you haven't had any failures, you probably haven't taken any risk. And now MXF is a world standard for digital cinema. I'm told it's NATO image file exchange. It was a long battle because there were a lot of interests in proprietary standards, but it's really worth a battle, and that's where SMPTE has such an important job to do. And this really shows the project I'm most proud of. Well, you can see Bill there with Tony Salmon, the director of production, where we made, with ARRI partners, we started a new vision of how you would capture pictures. This was a €9 million project. My new owners of Snell backed out of it because they couldn't see any immediate return. But it's nice to say that not only did it get ARRI into digital cinematography, where they weren't in it, they were just helping us with film samples, but the projects that we had to back out of with the new investors have been taken up by others, and there are 1 or 2 European projects continuing the same depth segmentation and better use of high-resolution capture at higher frame rates. We were capturing 72 frames progressive. I think that's me. I think the next slide thanks you for your patience. And if I can't find the button, but I'm done.